The gate was still broken, just as Eleanor Whitmore remembered it, and she slipped through the gap in the iron bars with her heart pounding against her ribs. Ravenswood Castle rose before her in the darkness, its windows black except for one, high in the west tower, where a single candle burned. She had sworn she would never come back, yet here she was, 3 months after she had been sent away in disgrace, walking through the frozen gardens at midnight, with her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, and her breath rising in pale clouds. She had come for one thing only. Her mother's locket, hidden behind a loose stone in the old library wall, the one place no one else knew about. She could not leave it behind. It was the last piece of her mother she had left, and she had been dragged from the castle so quickly on the day of her dismissal that there had been no time to retrieve it. Now she meant to take it and vanish again, before anyone knew she had ever set foot on Ravenswood soil. The side door by the kitchens was unlocked, as it always had been on nights when the cook forgot to check it. Eleanor eased it open and stepped into the dark passage, her slippers silent on the stone floor. The castle smelled the same as it always had, of beeswax polish and old wood smoke, and the familiarity of it nearly undid her. She pressed a hand to the wall and made herself keep moving. She was halfway down the corridor that led toward the library when she heard his voice. It came from behind a half-open door, low and rough, the voice of a man who thought no one was listening. She knew that voice better than she knew her own. Duke Julian Ashford. She had not heard it in 3 months, and the sound of it now stopped her cold in the middle of the corridor, one hand still pressed to the wall. He said her name. Not once, but twice, quietly, as though he were speaking to someone in the room with him, or perhaps to no one at all. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She should have kept walking. She should have turned back the way she had come and let the library wait for another night. Instead, she found herself drawn forward, step by careful step, until she stood just outside the door, close enough to see a sliver of candlelight spilling across the floor. "Eleanor," he said again, and this time she heard something break in his voice, something raw and unguarded that she had never heard from him before, not even in their most private moments. "I should have gone after her. I should have torn the house apart until I found the truth. Instead, I let her walk out that door, and I have not slept a full night since." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth to stop herself from making a sound. Who was he speaking to? She leaned closer, just enough to see through the gap in the door, and her heart nearly stopped. He was alone, standing before the cold hearth in his study, a glass of brandy untouched on the mantel beside him, speaking to an empty room as though she herself were standing in it. She had left Ravenswood believing he thought her a liar. She had left believing he had signed the letter of dismissal himself, that he had looked at the evidence against her and decided she was guilty without a single word in her defense. She had spent 3 months hating him for it, and grieving him just as fiercely, because a person could do both at once and it could tear them apart from the inside. But the man in that room did not sound like a man who believed her guilty. He sounded like a man haunted. "Margaret said the letters were in her own hand," he continued, and now he was speaking to the empty air with more force, as though arguing with himself. "I saw the handwriting. I saw it and I believed it, God forgive me, because it looked exactly like hers. But she never lied to me. Not once in 2 years. Why would she start on the one night it would cost her everything?" Eleanor's knees went weak. She had to grip the doorframe to keep herself upright. He knew, or if he did not know the whole truth, he suspected something was wrong. He had not simply cast her aside and forgotten her, as she had told herself every single night since she left, in order to make the pain bearable. He had been standing in this room, alone, turning the same question over and over like a stone in his hand. She should not be here. If he found her now, in the dead of night, sneaking through his home like a thief, it would only confirm every terrible thing his cousin had said about her character. But her feet would not move. She stood frozen in the corridor, listening to the man she had once loved more than her own life tear himself apart over a lie neither of them yet understood. A floorboard creaked beneath her weight. The sound was small, barely more than a whisper of wood, but in the silence of the sleeping castle it might as well have been a thunderclap. Eleanor froze, every muscle locked, as she heard movement inside the study. The scrape of a boot against stone. A pause. Then his voice, sharper now, carrying none of the raw grief from moments before. "Who is there?" She had 2 choices. She could run, back down the corridor and out into the gardens, and pray she reached the broken gate before he caught more than a glimpse of her cloak disappearing into the dark. Or she could stay and let him find her, and face whatever came next. Her body chose for her. She turned and ran. Her slippers slapped against the stone floor as she flew back down the corridor, past the kitchens, out through the side door into the biting cold of the garden. Behind her, she heard the study door thrown open, heard his footsteps quick and heavy on the stone, heard him call out again, not her name this time, but simply, "Stop, whoever you are." She did not stop. She ran across the frozen grass, her lungs burning, her cloak snagging on a rose bush she had once helped plant with her own hands in a life that felt impossibly far away now. The broken gate was ahead of her, a black gap in the iron fence, freedom on the other side of it. She was 3 steps from the gate when a hand closed around her wrist. The grip was not cruel, but it was firm, and it spun her around before she could pull free. For one terrible, breathless moment she stood face to face with Julian Ashford in the moonlight, close enough to see the shock written plainly across his features, close enough to see the exact moment recognition replaced confusion in his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, and this time her name was not spoken to an empty room. It was spoken to her, directly, his hand still wrapped around her wrist as though he feared that if he let go she would vanish like smoke and he would spend the rest of his life wondering if he had imagined her. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the bare branches above them, and somewhere in the castle behind him, a clock began to strike the hour, slow and solemn in the darkness, counting out the seconds while 2 people who had once loved each other stood frozen in the cold. 3 months of silence and grief, and unanswered questions stretching between them like a chasm neither one knew how to cross. It was Eleanor who broke first. "Let go of me," she whispered, though she made no real effort to pull away, and some small, foolish part of her heart hoped he would refuse. He did not let go. Instead, his grip gentled, his thumb brushing lightly across the inside of her wrist, and his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped to something low and unsteady. "I have looked for you," he said. "Every day since you left, I have looked for you. Where have you been hiding, Eleanor? And why, in God's name, have you come back to the one place you swore you would never set foot in again?" She looked up at him, at the man who had once promised her a future she had believed in with her whole heart, and felt 3 months of carefully built walls begin, dangerously, to crack. "I came for something I left behind," she said quietly. "I did not come for you." But even as the words left her mouth, standing there in the cold, with his hands still wrapped around her wrist, and the ghost of everything they had lost hanging in the air between them, she was not entirely certain she believed herself. Julian studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face as though he were trying to memorize it, or perhaps trying to convince himself she was truly there, and not some cruel trick conjured by his own exhausted mind. The moonlight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that told her he had not been sleeping, just as he had said inside that empty study. "Something you left behind," he repeated slowly, "after 3 months. In the middle of the night. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." "It is the truth," she said, lifting her chin, though her wrist still burned pleasantly under his touch, a sensation she despised herself for noticing. "My mother's locket. I hid it in the library before I left, and I did not have the chance to retrieve it before your men escorted me from the grounds." Something flickered across his face at the mention of the men who had escorted her out, a flash of something that looked almost like shame, quickly hidden. "I did not order that," he said quietly. "I want you to know that. Whatever else you believe of me, I did not order them to put their hands on you." "You signed the letter," Eleanor said, and her voice cracked despite her best effort to keep it steady. "You signed it, Julian. You looked at whatever lies your cousin placed before you, and you signed my name away without ever once asking me for the truth." His grip on her wrist loosened, though he did not release her entirely. "I have asked myself every single night since why I did not come to you first. I have no answer that will satisfy either of us. I was a coward, and I was afraid, and by the time I understood what fear had cost me, you were already gone, and no one would tell me where." The clock inside the castle finished its slow toll and fell silent, leaving only the sound of the wind moving through the bare trees and the quiet, ragged rhythm of their breathing. Eleanor searched his face for the calculation she had expected to find there, the same cold politeness that had marked their final conversation 3 months ago, and found instead something far more dangerous. She found a man who looked as broken as she felt. "I should go," she said, though she made no move toward the gate. "You should," he agreed, though he made no move to let her go either. "And yet here we both are." A sound broke the stillness, a door opening somewhere near the kitchens, followed by the low murmur of a woman's voice calling out into the dark, asking if someone was there. Eleanor's whole body went rigid. If she was found here, at this hour, in the Duke's company, It would confirm every wicked story that had already been whispered about her name across 3 counties. "Come inside," Julian said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "Just for a moment. No one will think anything of it if you are seen leaving in daylight through the front gate as any respectable visitor might. But if you are found now, sneaking through my gardens in the dark, it will only give them more to say." "I have given them enough already," Eleanor said bitterly. "Then let me give you nothing more to lose," he answered, and something in the quiet steadiness of his voice made her hesitate. She glanced back toward the sound of the approaching servant's lantern light, weighing the danger of being seen against the danger of stepping back inside the walls she had fled only minutes before. In the end, it was not fear that decided her, but the memory of his voice in that empty study, speaking her name to no one, as though he had been carrying her with him every single day since she left. She let him lead her back toward the side door, her wrist still warm where his fingers had held it, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with being caught, and everything to do with what she might feel once she was alone with him again. Neither of them spoke as he guided her through the dark passage, past the kitchens where the lantern light had already faded back into silence, toward the study where the candle still burned low upon the mantel. It was only once the door had closed behind them, sealing out the cold and the danger of discovery, that Eleanor allowed herself to truly look at him, and to wonder, with a mixture of hope and dread she had not felt in 3 long months, what exactly he intended to say. The study looked exactly as she remembered it, shelves of leather-bound books climbing to the ceiling, the worn armchair by the window where she had once spent so many quiet evenings reading aloud while he worked through his correspondence. Julian gestured for her to sit, but Eleanor remained standing near the door, unwilling to let herself grow comfortable in a room that no longer belonged to her life. "Tell me what happened," he said, pouring a second glass of brandy and setting it on the small table beside the chair she refused to take. "Tell me your side of it, Eleanor. I never let you finish before they took you away." She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold of the garden still clinging to her skin despite the warmth of the fire. For 3 months she had rehearsed this moment in her mind, imagined 100 different ways it might unfold, and now that it was finally happening she found the words came slowly, dragged up from a place she had tried very hard to seal shut. It had begun, she told him, 6 months before that terrible night, when she had first come to Ravenswood as companion to his younger sister Charlotte. She had been hired to keep the girl company during her final year before her formal introduction into society, to help her with her letters and her music, and to serve as a steady, sensible presence in a household that had lost its mother years before. Eleanor had taken to Charlotte at once, and Charlotte to her, the two of them forming a friendship that felt more like sisters than employer and companion. It was through Charlotte that Eleanor had first come to know Edward Vane. He had arrived at Ravenswood that autumn, a distant cousin of a neighboring family, charming and well-spoken, with a way of making every woman in a room feel as though she were the only one worth his attention. Charlotte, young and flattered by his interest, had fallen for him quickly. Eleanor had not. There was something in the way Edward watched the household, cataloging its wealth and its weaknesses with a careful, patient eye, that made her uneasy from the very first evening. "I did not trust him," Eleanor said, watching Julian's face for any sign of disbelief, but he only listened, silent and still, his eyes never leaving her. "I told Charlotte as gently as I could that I thought his attentions came from calculation rather than affection. She did not want to hear it, of course. What young woman wants to be told the man who admires her is only after her fortune?" "You told me the same thing," Julian said quietly. "I remember. I did not listen closely enough." "You told me you would speak with him," Eleanor said. "And you did. I remember watching from the hallway window as the two of you argued in the garden, though I never learned exactly what was said between you." Julian's jaw tightened. "I told him his suit toward my sister was unwelcome, and that I expected him to leave Ravenswood within the week. He agreed, quite pleasantly, and thanked me for my honesty. I believed the matter was settled." "It was never settled," Eleanor said. "It only went quiet." She continued the story, her voice growing steadier as the memory carried her forward. In the weeks that followed, Edward had seemed to accept his dismissal with grace, but Eleanor had noticed small things that troubled her. Letters that went missing from Charlotte's writing desk, a ring of keys that vanished from the housekeeper's belt for the better part of an afternoon before mysteriously reappearing. She had begun to watch him more closely, certain something was being planned, though she could not yet say what. Then, 3 days before the night of her dismissal, she had found him in the library after midnight, searching through a locked drawer in the Duke's own desk. "I confronted him," Eleanor said. "He told me he was merely looking for a book he had borrowed and misplaced. It was a lie, and we both knew it, but I had no proof of anything beyond what I had seen with my own eyes. I told him I intended to inform you of what I had found. He asked me not to. He said if I kept silent, he would leave Ravenswood at once and trouble the family no further. And you agreed, Julian said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. I was a fool, Eleanor said bitterly. I believed that frightening him away was enough, that I did not need to burden you with the full truth of it when the danger seemed to have passed. 2 days later, my belongings were searched while I was walking with Charlotte in the garden, and letters were found among them. Letters I had never written, in handwriting that was, I am told, remarkably close to my own, describing an improper attachment between myself and you that had never existed outside the pages of those forged pages. Julian set down his glass, his hand not quite steady. Margaret brought them to me, he said. My cousin swore she had discovered them by accident while helping the housekeeper sort through linens for laundering. She wept as she showed them to me, said she was heartbroken to bring me such news, that she had agonized over whether to say anything at all. Margaret? Eleanor repeated, and something cold moved through her at the sound of the name. She had never liked Julian's cousin, though she had never been able to say precisely why. Margaret had always been polite, always correct in her manners, and yet there had been something watchful in the way she observed the household, not unlike the calculation Eleanor had once noticed in Edward Vane himself. You believe they conspired together, Julian said slowly, following the same thread of thought that had begun to unspool in Eleanor's mind. I do not know, Eleanor admitted. I only know that Edward Vane wished to remove me from this house because I had discovered him searching your desk, and that your cousin was remarkably eager to believe the worst of me on the strength of letters that appeared from nowhere, at precisely the moment they were needed. I do not believe in such convenient coincidence. Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching the flames for answers he had been chasing for 3 months without success. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hard in a way Eleanor had rarely heard from him. On the night you left, he said, I did not sign that letter easily. I want you to understand that, whatever else you believe of my character. Margaret placed those pages before me alongside the letters, and told me the servants were already whispering that Charlotte's own reputation would suffer if the scandal was allowed to spread, that the only way to protect this family was to remove you from the house before the story reached beyond these walls. I was not thinking clearly. I had just lost my father the year before. I was newly responsible for this entire estate, and I made the decision a frightened man makes, rather than the decision a just one would have made. You believed her over me, Eleanor said, and though she had told herself she would not cry, she felt the sting of tears gathering regardless. I believed the evidence in front of me, Julian said, because I did not yet understand how easily evidence can be manufactured by someone clever enough to want it. I have spent 3 months trying to make sense of the handwriting in those letters, comparing it against every sample of your writing I could find in this house, and the longer I studied it, the less certain I became that it was truly yours. He rose from his chair and crossed the room to the locked drawer of his desk, the very one Eleanor had once found Edward Vane searching through in the dead of night. He withdrew a small bundle of papers tied with ribbon and held them out to her. I kept them, he said. I could not bring myself to burn them, though I told Margaret that I had. Look at them again, Eleanor, and tell me honestly whether you believe your own hand produced these words. Eleanor took the letters with trembling fingers and unfolded the first page, her eyes scanning the familiar shapes of the letters, the loops and slants that did, at first glance, resemble her own hand closely enough to fool a careless observer. But as she studied it further, something small and wrong caught her attention. A particular curl at the tail of every letter "we" that she herself had never once formed in that manner. Not in 6 months of writing letters for Charlotte's lessons. Not in any note she had ever penned in this house. This is not my writing, she said slowly, certainty building with every word. It is close. It is very close, but it is not mine. Julian's eyes met hers across the small distance between them, and in them, she saw not triumph, but something closer to grief, the weight of a mistake that could not be undone, by simply learning the truth 3 months too late. Then we must find out who wrote it, he said quietly, and why they wanted so badly to see you gone from this house. Eleanor lowered herself into the armchair at last, the fight suddenly gone out of her legs, the letters still clutched in her hand as though letting them go might somehow undo the small, fragile relief of finally being believed. For 3 months she had carried the weight of his silence alone, certain that whatever affection he had once felt for her had curdled into contempt the moment Margaret placed those forged pages before him. To sit here now, in this familiar room, and hear him admit his own doubt, was almost more than she could bear. "Why did you never send word?" she asked quietly. If you suspected the letters were false, why did 3 months pass in silence? Julian's expression darkened, not with anger toward her, but with something closer to shame. I tried, he said. I sent a man to inquire after you at the address your reference had listed. A cousin in Bath, I believe. He returned and told me you had never arrived there, that no one by your name was known in that household. I did not know where else to search. I feared that if I made too public an inquiry, it would only draw more attention to the scandal and further damage whatever chance you had of rebuilding your life elsewhere. I never went to Bath, Eleanor admitted. I could not bear the thought of my aunt's questions, of explaining why I had been dismissed in disgrace from a household I had loved so dearly. I took a position instead as a seamstress's assistant in the village of Thornfield, under my mother's maiden name, so that no one would connect me to the story that had already begun to spread. Thornfield, Julian repeated, and something like disbelief crossed his face. That is scarcely 2 hours from here. I know, Eleanor said, a bitter smile touching her lips despite herself. I told myself it was foolish to stay so close, that I should travel further, somewhere no whisper of Ravenswood could ever reach me, and yet I could not bring myself to leave the county entirely. I told myself it was practical, that I had no funds for a longer journey. I am no longer certain that was the whole truth of it. Julian said nothing for a long moment, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders, a tension easing that Eleanor had not realized was there until it was gone. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes catching the firelight, close enough that the old, dangerous familiarity between them threatened to overwhelm every careful wall she had built these past 3 months. I looked for reasons to ride to Thornfield more times than I can count, he said quietly. I told myself it was to inspect the mill there, or to call upon the vicar about a matter of the parish. I never once admitted, even to myself, that I was hoping I might catch some glimpse of you in the market square. Eleanor's breath caught. Julian, let me finish, he said, his voice low and urgent now. I have spent 3 months believing I had lost you through my own cowardice, and tonight, you walked back through my gate, as though fate itself grew tired of waiting for me to come to my senses. I do not intend to let this chance slip away from me twice. For a moment, the space between them felt impossibly small, charged with everything unsaid across 3 long months of silence and grief. Eleanor felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by a pull she had tried and failed to extinguish since the night she left this house, before the sharp, sudden memory of Margaret's watchful eyes and Edward Vane's calculating smile rose up to steady her. We cannot simply forget what was done to me, she said, drawing back slightly, though she did not pull her hand away when his fingers closed gently around it. Whoever forged these letters wanted me gone badly enough to destroy my reputation, and yours along with it. If we do not learn who is responsible, and why, there is nothing to stop them from trying again. Julian's expression sobered, the heat of the moment giving way to something more measured and determined. You are right, he said. Forgive me. I allowed my relief at finding you to distract me from the danger you are still in. If Margaret and Edward Vane conspired together, as you suspect, then we are dealing with 2 people clever enough to forge a young woman's handwriting well enough to fool a grieving, distracted man. That is not the work of a moment's spite. That required planning, and patience, and access to your private letters over a period of weeks, if not months. Charlotte would know, Eleanor said suddenly, sitting up straighter. If Edward Vane courted her as long as he did, she may have letters of his in her own possession, correspondence we could compare against the hand in these forgeries, and she deserves to know the truth of the man she once believed she loved. She has asked after you nearly every week since you left, Julian said. She has never believed the story Margaret told, not truly, though she had no proof to offer against it. She will be glad beyond words to see you standing in this house again, Eleanor, whatever the hour. A distant sound broke the quiet of the study, the soft creak of floorboards somewhere above them, followed by hurried footsteps on the stairs. Julian rose quickly, releasing Eleanor's hand, his body angling instinctively between her and the door, as though to shield her from whoever approached. The footsteps grew closer, quick and light, unmistakably a woman's tread, and a moment later, the study door swung open to reveal a young woman in a dressing gown, her fair hair loose about her shoulders, candle in hand, her eyes widening in shock at the sight before her. Eleanor, Charlotte Ashford breathed, the candle trembling slightly in her grip. Is it truly you? Eleanor rose from the chair, her heart pounding with a fresh surge of emotion at the sight of the girl she had come to love as a sister during her time at Ravenswood. But before she could answer, another sound reached them from further down the corridor. A second set of footsteps, heavier and more deliberate, accompanied by the sharp, unmistakable voice of a woman Eleanor had hoped never to hear again.
Julian.
Margaret Ashford called out, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet halls of the sleeping castle. Whatever is happening down here at this hour? I heard voices, and I confess I am rather alarmed. Eleanor felt every muscle in her body go still. Whatever fragile peace had settled over the study in the last hour was about to be tested in the worst possible way. Margaret Ashford appeared in the doorway a moment later, wrapped in a dark blue robe, her hair pinned with the same rigid perfection it held even in the middle of the night, as though she had taken the time to compose herself fully before descending the stairs. Her eyes moved from Julian to Charlotte and finally settled on Eleanor, and for the briefest instant, so quick that Eleanor nearly missed it, something flickered across her composed features that looked very much like fear. It was gone, almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by an expression of careful, wounded surprise. "Eleanor Whitmore," Margaret said slowly, "I confess I did not expect to see you within these walls again, and certainly not at such an hour. Julian, is everything quite well?" "Everything is far from well," Julian said, his voice steady but carrying an edge Eleanor had not heard him use with his cousin before. "Eleanor has returned, and she has raised serious doubts about the letters you brought to me 3 months ago. Doubts I share, now that I have looked at them again with clearer eyes." Margaret's composure did not crack, though her fingers tightened visibly on the edge of her robe. "I do not understand what you mean. I brought you those letters because I believed it was my duty, as difficult as it was for me to do so. I take no pleasure in being the bearer of unhappy news, Julian, and I resent the implication that I acted with anything other than the family's best interest at heart." "No one has accused you of anything," Eleanor said carefully, watching the older woman's face for any further sign of that fleeting fear, "beyond bringing forward letters you believe to be genuine. But we have reason now to believe those letters were forged, and forged by someone with access to both my private correspondence and a great deal of patience." "Forged," Margaret repeated, and this time the surprise in her voice sounded almost too perfect, too carefully measured, like an actress delivering a line she had rehearsed many times before this moment arrived. "That is a serious accusation, Eleanor. Do you have proof of such a claim, or only your own wounded pride speaking?" Charlotte, who had been silent since Margaret's arrival, stepped forward with the candle still trembling slightly in her hand. "Cousin Margaret," she said, and there was a new firmness in her voice that Eleanor had never heard from the girl before. Eleanor was never anything but honest with this family. "I have missed her terribly these past months, and I have never once believed the story that was told about her, no matter how many times you assured me it must be true. Charlotte, you are young, and you do not fully understand the ways such matters can unfold," Margaret said, a note of impatience creeping into her tone. "I only ever sought to protect this family's reputation, and yours most of all. Edward Vane's attentions toward you were already becoming the subject of gossip before Eleanor's dismissal put an end to the matter entirely." "Edward Vane's attentions were the reason for the matter in the first place," Eleanor said quietly, watching closely as Margaret's eyes flicked toward her at the mention of his name, a fraction too sharp, a fraction too quick. "I discovered him searching through Julian's locked desk 3 days before I was dismissed. When I told him I intended to report what I had seen, he pleaded with me to remain silent and promised to leave Ravenswood at once. 2 days later, forged letters were discovered among my belongings, in handwriting remarkably close to my own, describing an attachment between myself and Julian that never existed." The room fell utterly silent. Margaret's face had gone very pale, though her chin remained lifted, her posture still rigidly correct even as the ground beneath her carefully constructed story began to shift. "You are suggesting," she said slowly, "that Edward Vane forged those letters himself, in order to silence you before you could expose whatever he was searching for in Julian's desk." "I am suggesting," Eleanor said, "that someone forged them. Someone with access to my handwriting samples, my personal belongings, and the opportunity to place false evidence exactly where it would be found at exactly the moment it was needed. I do not know for certain that it was Edward Vane alone. I have wondered, more than once these past 3 months, whether he acted entirely without help from someone already living within these walls." Margaret's hand rose to her throat, a small, involuntary gesture that betrayed more than her carefully measured words ever could. "I will not stand here and be accused of conspiring against a servant," she said, her voice rising. "I am the Duke's own cousin. I have lived in this house since I was a girl of 12 years old, when my own parents passed and Julian's father took me in out of kindness. I owe this family everything, and I would never do anything to bring it harm." "No one has named you outright," Julian said quietly, though his gaze remained fixed on his cousin with an intensity that made her flinch. "But I find myself wondering, Margaret, how it was that you came to discover those letters while helping the housekeeper sort linens, when I have since learned from Mrs. Fenimore that she recalls no such assistance from you that week, nor any occasion at all in recent memory when you have troubled yourself with the laundering of household linens." The silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier, more dangerous, the sound of a carefully built lie beginning to buckle under its own weight. Margaret's eyes darted between Julian and Eleanor, searching for some escape from the trap that had closed around her, and finding none. "Mrs. Fenimore is an old woman with a failing memory," Margaret said, but the conviction had gone out of her voice, replaced by something thinner and more desperate. "Mrs. Fenimore has kept the accounts of this household for 20 years without a single error," Julian said. "I trust her memory considerably more than I trust the story you brought to me 3 months ago." Eleanor watched Margaret's face crumble by degrees, the mask of wounded innocence slipping to reveal something far more calculating underneath, and she felt no satisfaction in the sight, only a deep and weary sadness for the years of pretended kindness that had concealed whatever true feeling lay beneath it. "You do not understand what it is to live in another family's house your whole life," Margaret said finally, her voice low and bitter now, all pretense abandoned. "To be given kindness, yes, but never truly belonging, never having a fortune of your own, always dependent on the goodwill of a cousin who might marry at any moment and leave you with nothing at all. Edward promised me a share of what he intended to take from this house, if only I helped him find what he was searching for, and helped him remove the one person clever enough to notice what he was doing." "What was he searching for?" Julian demanded, stepping forward. "What did he want from my desk badly enough to risk everything on such a scheme?" "The deed to the northern property," Margaret said, and now that the truth had begun to spill out, it came quickly, as though she had been longing for months to set the weight of it down. "The old mining rights your grandfather never properly recorded with the county. Edward learned of it through a solicitor's clerk he had bribed, and believed that if he could obtain the original papers before anyone else noticed their value, he could claim the land was legally his through some distant, half-forgotten connection in his family line. He needed time, and privacy, to search this house without interference. Eleanor's suspicion threatened all of it." Eleanor felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as the full shape of the conspiracy became clear. It had never truly been about her at all, not in Margaret's eyes. She had simply been an obstacle, a witness inconveniently placed in the path of a much larger scheme, and her reputation, her happiness, her entire future had been sacrificed without a second thought to clear that path. "Where is Edward Vane now?" Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I do not know," Margaret said, and for the first time that night, Eleanor believed she was telling the complete truth. "He left for London shortly after Eleanor was dismissed, saying he needed time to properly prepare the false claim before presenting it to the county courts. He promised to send for me once matters were settled, once the land was legally his and he no longer needed to fear discovery. I have heard nothing from him in nearly 6 weeks." Julian turned to Charlotte, his expression softening slightly as he addressed his younger sister. "Go and wake Mrs. Fenimore," he said gently. "Tell her we will need her ledgers from the autumn months, and ask her to send word to the stable that I will need a horse readied at first light." Charlotte nodded, though her eyes lingered on Margaret with an expression of profound hurt and confusion before she hurried from the room to do as she was asked. Once she had gone, Julian turned back to his cousin, and the weight of 3 months of grief and betrayal seemed to settle fully across his features. "You will remain confined to your rooms until I decide what is to be done with you," he said. "I do not know yet whether I will bring this matter before the magistrate, or whether some quieter resolution might spare what remains of this family's dignity. But do not mistake my hesitation for forgiveness, Margaret. What you did to Eleanor cannot be undone by any explanation, however desperate the circumstances that drove you to it." Margaret's shoulders sagged, the last of her composure finally abandoning her entirely, and for a moment, Eleanor almost felt pity for the woman who had so nearly destroyed her life. Almost, but not quite. Not when she thought of 3 months spent hiding under a false name in a village 2 hours from everything and everyone she loved, believing herself forgotten and despised by the one man whose good opinion had mattered more to her than anything else in the world. A servant was summoned to escort Margaret to her chambers, and once the sound of her footsteps had faded up the staircase, Julian turned to face Eleanor fully, the study once again quiet around them, though the ground beneath both their feet had shifted entirely in the space of a single hour. "I must ride for London at first light," he said. "If Edward Vane believes himself still safe, still unaware that his scheme has begun to unravel, then I mean to reach him before he learns otherwise, and disappears beyond any hope of finding him again. The forged deed must be recovered, and he must answer for what he has done, both to this family's land and to your good name. Then I am coming with you, Eleanor said, before she had fully considered the words, though she found she did not wish to take them back. Julian's eyes met hers, surprise giving way quickly to something that looked almost like relief. Eleanor, the roads to London are long, and the company of a man not your husband, even on a matter such as this, will only feed the very rumors we are trying to extinguish. My reputation has already survived the worst that gossip can invent, Eleanor said steadily. I do not intend to sit quietly in this castle while my name is finally, properly cleared by someone else's hand. This is my fight as much as it is yours, Julian, and I have earned the right to see it through to its end. For a long moment he only looked at her, something warm and fierce kindling behind his tired eyes, and then, slowly, he nodded. Then we leave together, he said, at first light. Charlotte returned a short while later, her expression still shadowed with the hurt of Margaret's betrayal, though she managed a small, determined smile when she saw Eleanor still standing beside her brother. Mrs. Fenimore is awake, she said. She has already begun searching the ledgers, though she says it may take some hours to find every entry that touches upon the northern property. I told her we needed whatever record exists of the mining rights, no matter how old or how buried in the household accounts. Thank you, Charlotte, Julian said, and something in his voice carried a new gentleness, the tone of a man who had come dangerously close to losing everything that mattered to him in the space of a single night, and meant now to hold what remained a little more carefully. I know this has been a difficult night for you as well. Charlotte's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears back with the same stubborn composure Eleanor remembered so fondly from her time at Ravenswood. I trusted her, she said quietly. I have known Margaret my whole life. I never once suspected she could act with such coldness toward someone I loved as a sister. Eleanor crossed the room and took the younger woman's hands in her own, the warmth of the gesture carrying 3 months of longing for the friendship she had believed lost forever. None of this was your doing, she said. You were as much a victim of Edward Vane's scheming as I was, perhaps more, since he preyed upon your genuine affection to gain a foothold in this house. You have nothing to reproach yourself for, Charlotte. Not tonight, and not ever. Charlotte nodded, though her grip on Eleanor's hands tightened, as though she feared that letting go might somehow cause her friend to vanish again into the darkness from which she had so unexpectedly returned. Promise me you will come back safely, she said, both of you. London is a large and dangerous city, and Edward Vane has already shown himself capable of cruelty I never imagined possible from him. We will be careful, Julian promised, though the grim set of his jaw suggested he understood the danger as well as anyone in the room. Edward Vane has a great deal to lose now that his scheme has begun to unravel, and desperate men do not always behave rationally when they see everything slipping from their grasp. The remainder of the night passed in careful preparation. Mrs. Fenimore, true to her word, produced within a few hours a bundle of old estate records that confirmed the mining rights to the northern property had indeed been properly recorded decades earlier, under the name of Julian's grandfather, though the original deed itself appeared to be missing from the strongbox where it should have been kept. A search of Margaret's chambers, conducted with her reluctant cooperation once she understood the alternative was an immediate summons to the magistrate, turned up a set of letters between herself and Edward Vane that confirmed every detail of the scheme she had already confessed, along with a rough copy of the false claim he intended to present to the county courts. He will need the original deed itself before any court will take his claim seriously, Julian said, studying the papers by candlelight as the first gray hint of dawn began to touch the windows of the study, which means he does not yet have it. It must still be hidden somewhere within this house, or else he took it with him to London to have it altered by some corrupt clerk willing to forge the necessary signatures. If he needs it altered, Eleanor said, then he cannot yet have presented his claim to any court. There may still be time to stop him before the false deed becomes a matter of public record. There may be, Julian agreed, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed how little comfort he took from the uncertainty of it. But we cannot know for certain until we reach London ourselves, and learn what progress, if any, he has already made. By the time the sun had fully risen over the eastern hills, casting pale gold light across the frost-covered gardens where Eleanor had crept so fearfully only hours before, 2 horses stood saddled and ready in the courtyard, along with a modest carriage for the longer stretches of the journey, where riding would prove too exhausting to sustain. Charlotte stood at the top of the front steps, wrapped now in a proper morning gown, watching with visible worry as Julian checked the girth of his saddle one final time. Take care of him, Charlotte said quietly to Eleanor, though there was warmth rather than reproach in the words. He has not been himself these past months. I have watched him grow thinner, quieter, more prone to long silences than I have ever known him to be. I think perhaps only you can bring him fully back to who he was before all of this began." "I will do what I can," Eleanor said, though privately she wondered whether either of them could ever be entirely who they once were, before disgrace and forgery and 3 months of separation had left their marks upon them both. Some wounds healed cleanly. Others left scars that changed the shape of a person forever, for better or for worse. Julian helped her into the carriage himself, his hand lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary against hers as she settled onto the worn leather seat. "Are you certain of this?" he asked quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "Once we begin this journey, there will be no quiet way to undo it. Whatever we find in London, whatever becomes of Edward Vane and the truth of what he has done, your name will be tied to mine in the telling of it, for good or for ill." "My name has already been tied to yours since the moment those forged letters were discovered," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I would rather it be tied to yours through truth and courage than through a lie neither of us chose. I am certain, Julian. More certain than I have been of anything in 3 long months." Something eased in his expression at her words, a tension she had not fully realized he was carrying until she watched it lift from his shoulders. He nodded once, climbed onto his own horse, and gave the signal for the small party to depart. As the carriage rolled forward through the gates of Ravenswood, past the very same broken iron bars she had slipped through in secret and fear only hours before, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in 3 months, to feel something close to hope. The road to London stretched long and uncertain ahead of them, and somewhere at the end of it waited a man desperate enough to have already destroyed one innocent life in pursuit of a fortune that was never rightfully his. But for the first time since the night of her disgrace, Eleanor did not face that uncertainty alone. London greeted them 2 days later with grey skies and the constant clatter of carriage wheels against wet cobblestone, a city so vast and indifferent that Eleanor felt her earlier resolve waver slightly as she stepped down from the carriage outside a modest inn near Covent Garden. Julian had chosen the location deliberately, close enough to the fashionable districts where Edward Vane was likely to be found, yet unremarkable enough that their presence would draw little notice. "We will begin with the solicitor's offices near Lincoln's Inn," Julian said, once they had secured rooms and taken a hurried meal. "If Edward Vane intends to have that deed forged or altered, he will need a clerk willing to do the work, and such men do not advertise their services openly. We must ask carefully, and offer enough coin to loosen a few careful tongues." They spent the remainder of that first day moving from office to office, Julian presenting himself as a gentleman seeking discreet legal assistance for a property matter, careful never to mention Edward Vane's name directly, until he had gauged whether the clerk before him seemed the sort willing to bend the law for the right price. Eleanor remained close at his side throughout, though she said little, watching instead the faces of the men they questioned for any flicker of recognition or unease. It was in the 4th office they visited, a cramped and dusty room above a printer's shop, that they finally found what they were searching for. The clerk, a nervous young man named Percival Hawes, went pale the moment Julian mentioned a distant cousin seeking to establish a claim on a northern mining property. He glanced toward the door as though considering flight, and it was only when Julian placed a small stack of coins upon the desk, along with a quiet but unmistakable promise that refusal to cooperate would end far worse for him than honesty, that the young man's resolve finally broke. "A gentleman came to me nearly a month ago," Hawes admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted a deed altered, the date and the signature both, to make it appear as though the mining rights had passed through a different line of inheritance than the true record showed. I told him such work was beyond what I was willing to do, that the risk of discovery was too great for the sum he offered." "And did he accept your refusal?" Julian asked. "He raised his offer considerably," Hawes said, shame creeping into his voice. "I am not a wealthy man, sir. I have a mother and 2 younger sisters who depend upon my wages, and the sum he offered would have secured their comfort for years to come. I agreed to help him, though I have not yet completed the work. I told him I required more time to make the alterations convincing enough to withstand scrutiny." "Where can we find him now?" Eleanor asked, stepping forward. Hawes hesitated, glancing between them with visible fear. "He has taken rooms at a house on Bertram Street, near Marylebone. He does not go out often during the day, fearing recognition, but he is expected here again tomorrow evening to collect the finished deed." Julian's expression hardened. "Then we will be here to meet him instead." That evening, as they walked back toward their inn through the crowded, lamp-lit streets, Eleanor found herself unusually quiet, turning over the pieces of the scheme in her mind. Something about the timing troubled her, a detail she could not quite bring into focus. "What is it?" Julian asked, noticing her distraction. "If Edward Vane does not go out often for fear of recognition, she said slowly. Then how did Margaret continue corresponding with him these past 6 weeks, as she claimed she had not heard from him at all? Either she lied to us about the silence between them, or someone else has been carrying messages on his behalf, someone who could move freely through London without drawing suspicion. Julian stopped walking, the color draining slightly from his face, as the same troubling thought took shape in his own mind. You believe he has an accomplice here in the city as well? I believe it would be foolish to assume Margaret was his only ally in this scheme, Eleanor said. A man clever enough to plan a forged deed and a false inheritance claim would not likely trust his entire fortune to a single conspirator, with no backup should that conspirator's nerve fail, as Margaret's very nearly did tonight. They returned to Hawes's office the following morning, before the young clerk had opened for the day, and found him more forthcoming with a second, smaller payment, and the promise that his cooperation would be remembered favorably should the matter ever come before a magistrate. He confirmed, after some hesitation, that Edward Vane had indeed corresponded with someone in London throughout the 6 weeks of his hiding, a man named Gerald Finch, a moneylender with a reputation for financing risky ventures in exchange for a substantial share of the eventual profit. Finch has been funding Edward's expenses here in the city, Hawes explained. The alteration of the deed, the rooms on Bertram Street, even the bribe he offered me. In exchange, Finch is to receive a third share of whatever profit the mining rights eventually yield, once the false claim has been established. A moneylender with that much invested in Edward Vane's success will not simply stand aside and watch his investment collapse, Julian said grimly. If Finch learns his scheme has been discovered before we can reach Edward, he may well help him disappear entirely, and take the forged deed with him beyond any hope of recovery. Then we cannot wait until tomorrow evening as planned, Eleanor said. We must find Bertram Street today, before word of our inquiries here reaches either of them. Julian nodded, already moving toward the door. I will hire a carriage. We can be there within the hour. The house on Bertram Street proved to be a narrow, unremarkable building squeezed between a milliner's shop and a small chapel, its windows curtained against the gray afternoon light. Julian instructed the driver to wait a short distance away, out of view of the windows, while he and Eleanor approached on foot, their steps quiet against the damp pavement. You should remain here, Julian said quietly, as they drew near the front door. If Edward Vane is inside, there is no telling how he might react to being confronted, and I will not risk your safety after everything you have already suffered because of him. I did not travel 2 days to London to wait outside on a street corner while you face him alone, Eleanor said firmly. Whatever danger exists inside that house, I have already proven myself capable of facing worse. I am coming with you, Julian, and that is not a matter for further discussion. He studied her for a moment, something like reluctant admiration flickering across his features, before he nodded once and reached for the door. It was unlocked. They stepped into a narrow hallway smelling faintly of tobacco smoke and stale wine, a single lamp burning low near the staircase. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked, followed by the low murmur of voices, 2 men speaking in tones too quiet to make out clearly from below. Julian moved toward the stairs, and Eleanor followed close behind, her heart pounding with the same fearful anticipation she had felt 3 nights ago, creeping through the dark corridors of Ravenswood toward a voice she had never expected to hear again. This time, however, she was not alone, and whatever waited at the top of those stairs, she meant to face it standing beside the man who had once again, against every fear she had carried these past 3 months, become someone she trusted with her whole heart. They reached the landing just as the door at the end of the hallway swung open, revealing a man Eleanor recognized instantly despite the months that had passed since she last saw him. His once carefully groomed appearance now showing the strain of weeks spent hiding from the consequences of his own greed. Edward Vane froze in the doorway, his eyes widening first with shock, and then, as understanding dawned, with something far colder and more dangerous. Whitmore, he said slowly, his gaze flicking to Julian beside her, and the Duke himself. How very resourceful of you both to have found me so quickly. I confess I had hoped for a little more time before this particular reckoning arrived. The time for hiding is finished, Vane, Julian said, his voice hard as iron. We know everything. The forged letters, the mining rights, Margaret's involvement, and now Gerald Finch's money funding your scheme here in London. Hand over the deed, and whatever forgery you have already had prepared, and perhaps the magistrate will show some small mercy for the theft you have not yet fully completed. Edward's expression flickered, calculation replacing shock with remarkable speed, and Eleanor felt a cold warning settle in her chest even before he spoke again, his hand moving with deliberate slowness toward the inside pocket of his coat. I am afraid, he said quietly, that surrendering is not quite as simple a matter as you seem to believe. Behind him, in the shadowed room, another figure rose from a chair near the window, a heavy-set man with a hard, assessing gaze that Eleanor recognized immediately from Hawes's description as belonging to Gerald Finch. The moneylender studied Julian and Eleanor with the calm calculation of a man accustomed to weighing risk against profit, and whatever conclusion he reached in that brief moment clearly did not favor caution. Duke of Ravenswood, Finch said, stepping into the doorway beside Edward Vane, his voice carrying none of the younger man's nervous energy, only a cold, businesslike patience. I have invested a considerable sum in Mr. Vane's venture, and I do not intend to see that investment vanish, simply because the two of you have grown clever enough to trace our steps to London. Then you have invested your money poorly, Julian said, holding his ground, despite the two men now blocking the narrow hallway before them. The claim you have funded is built entirely upon forgery and theft. No court in this country will honor a deed altered by a bribed clerk, and both of you will find yourselves facing considerably harsher consequences than the loss of an investment once the full truth is laid before a magistrate. Edward's hand had not moved from inside his coat, and Eleanor watched with growing dread as his fingers closed around something concealed there. There is still time to reach an arrangement, he said, his voice taking on a wheedling, desperate edge that Eleanor recognized from the last conversation she had ever had with him, 3 days before her disgrace, when he had begged her to stay silent about what she had witnessed in Julian's study. A quiet settlement. A portion of the mining profits divided fairly between us, in exchange for your silence and mine. No magistrates, no scandal, no ruin for anyone involved. You forget, Eleanor said, stepping forward despite the warning look Julian shot in her direction, that I have already lived through the ruin you speak of, Edward. I lost my position, my reputation, and 3 months of my life hiding under a false name because of the scheme you and Margaret constructed to silence me. I have no interest whatsoever in protecting you from the consequences you have earned. Something shifted in Edward's expression at her words, the desperate wheedling giving way to something colder and more dangerous, and Eleanor felt Julian's hand move protectively to her arm, drawing her half a step behind him, even as he kept his own gaze fixed steadily on the two men before them. You should not have come here, Edward said quietly, and the hand inside his coat finally emerged, closing around the small, dark shape of a pistol that had clearly been concealed there since before they arrived. Eleanor's breath caught, her whole body going rigid with fear, though Julian did not so much as flinch, his eyes never leaving Edward's face. Put that away, Finch said sharply, before Julian could respond, alarm finally breaking through his businesslike composure. I did not agree to fund a scheme that ends in violence against a Duke of the Realm, Vane. That is a hanging offense for both of us, and I have no intention of swinging from a rope over your ruined pride. He will destroy everything, Edward said, though his hand wavered slightly at Finch's sharp tone. Everything I have worked for these past months, everything you have invested, gone the moment he walks out that door and reaches the nearest magistrate. Then we negotiate, Finch said firmly, stepping between Edward and the doorway with the deliberate authority of a man unwilling to let a smaller player ruin a larger investment through panic. Put the pistol away, and let us speak like reasonable men. Nothing is gained by threatening a duke in broad daylight with witnesses in the street below who will certainly have heard raised voices by now. The mention of witnesses seemed to reach Edward in a way that neither reason nor threat had managed, his eyes flicking toward the window and the narrow street beyond it, where indeed a small cluster of curious passers-by had begun to gather, drawn by the sound of raised voices from the house above. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the pistol, though he did not release it entirely. The deed, Julian said, his voice steady despite the tension still thick in the narrow hallway. Where is it? Finch, apparently deciding that his own survival mattered considerably more than loyalty to a partner whose scheme had already begun to collapse, answered before Edward could stop him. In the desk in that room, he said, nodding toward the chamber behind them. Both the original and the altered copy Hawes prepared, though I understand the alteration was never fully completed. Finch, Edward said sharply, betrayal flashing across his features, but the moneylender only shrugged, already calculating, Eleanor suspected, how best to salvage what remained of his own interests, now that the scheme had unraveled beyond any hope of recovery. I have no intention of hanging for your failures, Vane, Finch said coldly. Surrender the papers, and perhaps we can all walk away from this house with our necks intact. Edward's face contorted with fury and desperation, as Finch's words hung in the narrow hallway, the last of his careful plans crumbling before his eyes. For a moment, Eleanor feared he might raise the pistol again, driven by the particular recklessness of a man who has nothing left to lose. But Julian stepped forward with a calm, deliberate authority that seemed to fill the entire space between them. "Think carefully, Vane," Julian said, his voice low and steady. "Whatever happens in the next few moments will determine how the rest of your life unfolds. Surrender the deed, and I will see to it that the magistrate hears of your cooperation. Continue down this path, and you will hang for threatening a peer of the realm in front of witnesses, regardless of what becomes of the mining rights." The room seemed to hold its breath. Edward's hand trembled around the pistol, his eyes darting between Julian, Eleanor, and Finch, searching for some option that had not already closed before him. Finally, with a sound that was almost a sob, he lowered the weapon entirely and set it upon a small table beside the door, his shoulders sagging with the collapse of every ambition that had driven him these past months. "The desk," he said hoarsely. "Top drawer. I never even had the chance to properly enjoy what I stole." Julian moved past him cautiously into the room, retrieving both the original deed and the partially altered copy from the drawer Edward indicated, examining each briefly before tucking them securely inside his coat. Eleanor watched the tension drain slowly from his shoulders as he confirmed the papers were genuine, the true record of his grandfather's mining rights finally safe and beyond any further tampering. "I will send word to the nearest magistrate's office," Julian said, turning back to face the two men. "Both of you will remain in this house until officers arrive to take you into custody. Attempt to flee, and I promise you the consequences will be considerably worse than whatever punishment the courts might otherwise impose." Finch, ever practical, seated himself calmly in the chair by the window, apparently resigned to whatever fate awaited him, while Edward slumped against the wall, all the fight finally gone out of him. Eleanor felt a strange, hollow relief settle over her, as she watched the man who had destroyed 3 months of her life, reduced to this broken, defeated figure, though the relief carried with it none of the triumph she had once imagined she might feel in this moment. They waited in the small parlor below while a boy was sent running for the magistrate's office, Julian standing close beside her near the window, both of them silent for a long moment, as the enormity of what had just occurred began to settle over them. "It is finished," Julian said quietly, though his eyes carried a weariness that suggested he understood as well as she did, that some wounds did not close simply because the truth had finally come to light. "Not entirely," Eleanor said. "There is still Margaret to consider, and the matter of how this will be explained to society once word spreads, as it inevitably will, that the Duke of Ravenswood traveled to London to confront a forger and a moneylender in pursuit of a dismissed companion's cleared name." "Let them talk," Julian said, and something in his tone made her look up at him properly for the first time since they had entered the house on Bertram Street. "I have spent 3 months caring far too much about what other people whispered, and it cost me the one thing that mattered more than any of it. I do not intend to make that mistake again." Officers arrived within the hour, a senior constable accompanied by 2 younger men who listened with growing gravity, as Julian explained the full scope of the scheme, from the forged letters that had driven Eleanor from Ravenswood, to the altered deed intended to strip the estate of its rightful mining rights. The constable examined the recovered papers carefully, comparing the genuine deed against the partially completed forgery, and nodded grimly when he saw the extent of the deception laid out before him. "This is no small matter, Your Grace," the constable said, tucking both documents into a leather satchel for safekeeping, until the matter could be properly presented before a magistrate. "Forgery of a legal deed, attempted theft of property, and now this business with a pistol drawn against a peer of the realm. Mr. Vane and Mr. Finch will answer for all of it in due course. I expect the courts will take a dim view of gentlemen who threaten violence when their schemes unravel." Edward said nothing throughout the questioning, his earlier bravado entirely extinguished, while Finch answered every question with the same cold, practical composure he had shown from the moment they discovered him, clearly already calculating how best to minimize his own punishment now that cooperation seemed the only remaining path forward. Eleanor watched the 2 men led away in the custody of the officers with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest, relief mixed with something almost like sorrow for the ruin they had brought upon themselves through greed that might so easily have been resisted. "Will Margaret face the same fate?" Eleanor asked quietly, once the officers had departed and only she and Julian remained in the small parlor, the afternoon light beginning to fade toward evening beyond the curtained windows. Julian was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the question over with the same careful deliberation he had shown throughout the long ordeal. "I do not know yet," he admitted. "She is family, whatever wrong she has done, and I confess I am not entirely certain what justice looks like when it must be weighed against years of shared history and whatever genuine desperation drove her to such an act." I think perhaps I will speak with her properly once we return to Ravenswood and decide then what path forward serves both justice and whatever mercy the situation might still allow. That seems wise, Eleanor said. Whatever she has done, I do not think either of us wishes to see her hang for it, even if her actions caused a great deal of suffering. No, Julian agreed. I find I have had quite enough of suffering caused by this whole affair. I would rather see it end in something closer to resolution than further ruin, where that is possible. They sent word ahead to Ravenswood that evening, a brief letter to Charlotte assuring her of their safety and the successful recovery of the deed, promising a fuller account once they returned home in the coming days. The innkeeper's wife, noting the exhaustion plain on both their faces, insisted on providing a proper supper before either of them could retire, and it was only once the meal had been cleared away that Eleanor and Julian finally stepped back out into the London evening for a short walk, to settle their thoughts before the night's rest. The sky by then darkened to deep purple, lamplighters moving methodically down the street, igniting the gas lamps one by one against the gathering dusk. You must be exhausted, Julian said, as they walked slowly back toward their inn, the carriage having been dismissed hours earlier to make room for the magistrate's own transport. It has been a long 2 days, and a longer night before that. I find I am too relieved to feel tired, Eleanor admitted, though even as she spoke the words, a deep weariness was beginning to settle into her bones. The accumulated exhaustion of 3 months of grief, finally allowed to release its grip, now that the truth had been laid bare before witnesses who could not simply dismiss it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the noise of London settling into its evening rhythm around them, until Julian spoke again, his voice quieter now, more hesitant than she had heard it since their reunion in the frozen gardens of Ravenswood. Eleanor, he said, I owe you an apology far greater than anything I have offered so far. Not simply for signing that letter of dismissal without asking for your side of the story, though that alone deserves far more contrition than I have given. I owe you an apology for every day since then that I allowed my fear of scandal, my fear of what more damage might be done to this family's reputation, to outweigh my certainty of your character. I knew you, Eleanor. I knew you were not the sort of woman who would forge letters or invent a scandalous attachment for her own gain. And still I let doubt win, because doubt was easier to live with than the guilt of having failed you. Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the lamplight, the noise of the city fading into the background as she studied the raw honesty in his expression. You came to find me tonight, she said softly. You spent 3 months searching, even when you believed I had vanished entirely beyond your reach. That is not the behavior of a man who truly doubted my character, Julian. That is the behavior of a man who could not bear to accept the lie he had been told, even when every piece of evidence seemed to confirm it. I should have trusted that instinct from the very beginning, he said, before Margaret ever brought those letters to me, before I ever allowed myself to imagine, even for a single moment, that you could be capable of the deception she described. We cannot undo what has already happened, Eleanor said gently. The 3 months are gone, and nothing either of us says now will return them to us, but I do not wish to spend whatever time remains dwelling on what was lost, when there is still so much that might yet be found. I think of Thornfield often, she continued, half to herself. The little room above the seamstress's shop, the sound of her needle clicking against her thimble late into the evening, while I hemmed skirts for women I had never met and would never see again. I told myself I was building a new life there, quiet and unremarkable, safe from anyone who might recognize my name. But I think, in truth, I was only waiting for something to change, though I could not have said what, or how, or whether it would ever come. I wish I had known where to find you sooner, Julian said, his voice heavy with the same regret that had colored so much of their conversation since her return. 2 hours. You were only 2 hours away from me the entire time, hemming skirts and waiting for a life that had already slipped past both of us. Perhaps it needed those 3 months, Eleanor said slowly, testing the thought even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. Not because the separation itself held any value, for I would not wish that grief on either of us again for any price, but because I needed the time to understand what I truly wanted, apart from you, apart from Ravenswood, apart from anyone else's expectation of who I ought to be. I am not the same woman who left that castle in disgrace 3 months ago, weeping and certain her whole life had been ruined beyond repair. I am someone steadier now, someone who knows her own mind more clearly than she did before. And what does that steadier woman want? Julian asked quietly, watching her with an intensity that made the noise of the city around them seem to fade entirely into the background. Julian's eyes searched hers in the lamplight, something hopeful and fragile kindling behind the exhaustion of the long day. What is it you wish to find, Eleanor? She considered the question carefully, aware of the weight it carried, aware that whatever answer she gave now would shape the course of everything that followed. 3 months ago she had left Ravenswood believing her heart had been broken beyond any hope of repair. Tonight, standing in a lamplit London street with the man responsible for that heartbreak finally, fully restored to the person she had once trusted above all others, she found the old wound had not healed cleanly, but it had healed honestly, leaving behind not scar tissue but something closer to renewed strength. "I wish to find my way back to who I was before all of this began," she said finally, "not simply as your former companion's confidant, or as a woman whose reputation was nearly destroyed by another man's greed. I wish to find my way back to myself, Julian, whole and unashamed, and I find that I would very much like you to be part of that journey, if you are willing to walk it beside me, rather than simply watching from a distance as you have done these past months." Julian's hand found hers in the gathering dusk, his fingers threading through her own with a tenderness that carried none of the desperate urgency of their reunion in the gardens 3 nights before, only a quiet, steady certainty that felt, for the first time since her disgrace, like solid ground beneath her feet. "I am entirely willing," he said, "more than willing, Eleanor. I do not intend to let another single day pass without making my intentions toward you known, plainly and without the fear of scandal that cost us so much already. When we return to Ravenswood, I mean to make certain the entire county understands that Eleanor Whitmore was wronged, and that she has my complete trust, my complete respect, and my complete devotion, whatever gossip may follow in the wake of that declaration." Eleanor felt tears gathering, not from sorrow this time but from a fullness of feeling she had not allowed herself to imagine in 3 long months of quiet, careful grief. "That is a bold promise to make on a London street corner," she said, though her voice trembled with something closer to joy than doubt. "Then let me make it properly," Julian said, and something in his expression shifted, the exhaustion of the day giving way to a quiet, determined resolve. He drew a small object from his coat pocket, one Eleanor had not noticed him carrying, a slender gold ring set with a single small sapphire that caught the lamplight as he held it out to her. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "I have carried it with me every day since you left Ravenswood, though I could not have said, even to myself, precisely why. I think perhaps some part of me always believed we would find our way back to each other, however impossible that seemed on the darkest nights of these past 3 months." Eleanor stared at the ring, then at the man holding it out to her with such quiet, hopeful vulnerability, that every careful wall she had built around her heart these past months, finally, completely gave way. "Julian," she whispered. "I am not asking for an answer tonight," he said quickly, misreading her hesitation. "I know we have only just found our way back to honesty between us, and I do not wish to rush you into a decision before you have had time to fully trust that this is real, and not simply the relief of a difficult ordeal finally ended. I only wished you to know my intention, plainly, so that there could be no doubt remaining between us." "You misunderstand my silence," Eleanor said, a smile breaking through the tears still gathered in her eyes. "I am not hesitating because I doubt you, Julian. I am simply trying to find words equal to how deeply I wish to say yes." The relief that broke across his features in that moment was unlike anything Eleanor had seen from him before. 3 months of grief and doubt dissolving entirely into something bright and unguarded, and when he slid the ring gently onto her finger, his hands were not quite steady, though his eyes never left her face. "Then say it," he murmured, drawing her closer against the cold London evening. "Say yes, Eleanor, and let us finally begin building the life we very nearly lost." "Yes," she said, and the word carried 3 months of grief, at last into something whole and unbroken. "Yes, Julian, 1,000 times yes." The journey back to Ravenswood took 2 days, the carriage rolling steadily through countryside that seemed, to Eleanor's eyes, entirely transformed from the journey out, though the fields and hedgerows themselves had not changed at all. It was she who had changed, she realized, watching the familiar landscape pass by the window with the small sapphire ring catching the light on her hand, a symbol of everything that had been broken and everything that had been, against all likelihood, mended. Charlotte was waiting on the front steps when the carriage finally rolled through the gates, her face lighting with undisguised joy the moment she caught sight of Eleanor's hand through the carriage window, the ring immediately, unmistakably visible even from a distance. "You are engaged," Charlotte cried, rushing forward before the carriage had fully stopped, her earlier grief over Margaret's betrayal momentarily forgotten in the flood of happiness at this new, unexpected turn. "Julian, you actually did it. I confess I feared you would spend another 3 months working up the courage. I have learned, rather painfully, The cost of hesitation, Julian said, helping Eleanor down from the carriage with a warmth that no longer needed to hide itself behind careful propriety. I did not intend to make that same mistake twice. The household received the news with a mixture of relief and quiet celebration. The servants who had known Eleanor during her time as Charlotte's companion, openly delighted to see her restored to Ravenswood under such vastly improved circumstances. Mrs. Fenimore, in particular, embraced Eleanor with unabashed tears, declaring that she had never once believed the terrible things whispered about her, whatever appearances had suggested to the contrary. The matter of Margaret proved more difficult to resolve. Julian met with his cousin privately upon their return, a long and difficult conversation that Eleanor did not witness but which left Julian visibly shaken when he finally emerged from the study some hours later. He told Eleanor only the essential outcome that evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the drawing room, Charlotte having retired early to allow them a rare moment of privacy. "She will not face the magistrate," he said. "I could not bring myself to see her hang, or transported, whatever wrong she did. But she cannot remain at Ravenswood either, not after what has passed between us. I have arranged for her to live with a distant relation in Yorkshire, on a modest allowance, sufficient for her comfort but no longer drawn from this estate's principal funds. She left this morning, before you woke. Do you believe that is justice?" Eleanor asked carefully, uncertain herself what answer she hoped to hear. "I believe it is mercy," Julian said, after a long moment's thought. "Whether it is justice, I am less certain. She caused you real and lasting harm, Eleanor. Harm I do not believe she has fully reckoned with even now. But she is also the only family I have left beyond Charlotte, and I find I cannot entirely abandon that connection, however deeply she has damaged my trust in it. Perhaps in time, once enough distance has passed, some smaller reconciliation might be possible. Perhaps not. I do not know yet, and I am content to let that answer reveal itself slowly, rather than forcing a resolution I am not yet prepared to make." Eleanor considered his words carefully, understanding, perhaps better than most, the particular difficulty of forgiving someone who had caused such deep and lasting harm. She herself had not yet fully decided what she felt toward Margaret, whether pity or anger held the greater claim on her heart, and she suspected that answer, too, would only reveal itself with time. "I think that is a fair resolution," she said finally. "She is spared the worst consequence of her actions, yet she has lost the home and family she claimed to value so highly. That seems a fitting enough justice, even if it falls short of what some might demand." In the days following their return, Julian also turned his attention to Percival Hawes, the nervous young clerk whose cooperation had proven essential to recovering the deed before Edward Vane could complete his scheme. Rather than allowing the young man to face any lingering suspicion for his initial willingness to alter the documents, Julian wrote personally to the senior partners of the firm where Hawes was employed, explaining the full circumstances of his involvement, and the courage he had ultimately shown in choosing honesty over the substantial bribe he had been offered. "He has a mother and 2 sisters depending on him," Julian explained to Eleanor when she asked why he troubled himself so thoroughly with the fate of a stranger's clerk. "He made a poor choice at first, but he corrected it when it mattered most, and I do not believe a single moment of weakness under desperate circumstances should follow a man for the rest of his career. I have offered him a position managing correspondence for the Ravenswood estate instead, at considerably better wages than he currently earns, if he wishes to leave London and start anew somewhere his past mistakes carry no weight at all." Hawes accepted the offer within a fortnight, arriving at Ravenswood with his mother and 2 younger sisters in tow, and Eleanor found a quiet satisfaction in watching another life, nearly ruined by Edward Vane's greed, find its way instead toward something steadier and more hopeful. It seemed a fitting echo of her own circumstances, she thought, this quiet insistence of Julian's that mistakes made under pressure did not have to define a person forever, provided the choice that followed proved honest enough to outweigh them. News of Eleanor's return, and of her engagement to the Duke, spread through the county with predictable speed, and predictable variety in the telling. Some of the old whispers about her supposed impropriety resurfaced briefly, eager tongues delighting in any scandal touching a ducal household, but Julian moved quickly and deliberately to counter them, hosting a formal dinner within the first fortnight of their return, at which he personally, publicly, and unambiguously explained the full truth of the forged letters and Margaret's role in the scheme against her. "I will not have my future wife's name whispered about in corners," he told the assembled guests, his hand resting protectively at the small of Eleanor's back as he spoke. "When the truth reflects nothing but courage and honesty on her part, and considerable foolishness on my own, which I do not intend to hide from anyone curious enough to ask." The frankness of his admission, delivered with such evident sincerity, did more to quiet the gossip than any careful denial might have achieved. And within weeks, the story had shifted in the retelling from scandal to something closer to romance, the tale of a duke's steadfast love, finally triumphing over cruel deception, passed eagerly from drawing room to drawing room across the county. Even the vicar's wife, who had been among the first to whisper darkly about Eleanor's supposed impropriety when the original scandal broke, called upon Ravenswood personally that spring to offer her congratulations, her manner so warmly effusive that Eleanor found it difficult to hold on to any lingering resentment for the earlier unkindness. She had learned, over the course of those difficult months, that people were often quicker to believe the easiest story rather than the truest one, and that forgiveness, however imperfectly offered, was usually a better use of her remaining energy than prolonged bitterness toward every tongue that had wagged against her. "You have borne all of this with remarkable grace," Julian told her one evening, as they sat together reviewing the guest list for their approaching wedding, the fire crackling warmly in the same study, where he had once spoken her name to an empty room, believing himself entirely alone. "I do not think I could have forgiven so readily, were our positions reversed. I am not certain it is grace so much as exhaustion," Eleanor admitted, smiling faintly. "I have carried anger and grief in equal measure these past months, Julian, and I find I am simply tired of carrying either. It is easier in the end to let both go and make room instead for whatever good remains ahead of us." He reached across the small table between them and took her hand, the sapphire ring catching the firelight as it had once caught the lamplight on that London street. "Then let us make certain," he said quietly, "that whatever lies ahead is worthy of the exhaustion it cost you to reach it." Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, settling back into Ravenswood with a comfort that surprised her, given how thoroughly she had once believed herself banished from this place forever. Charlotte's friendship, restored fully and without reservation, proved a particular comfort, the two young women resuming their old habits of quiet conversation over afternoon tea and long walks through the gardens where, months before, Eleanor had fled in fear through frozen grass, toward a broken gate she had believed marked the end of everything she once hoped for. "Do you ever think of that night?" Charlotte asked one afternoon, as the two of them walked slowly through the rose garden, the same bushes Eleanor had once helped plant, now beginning to bud with the first green promise of spring. "The night you came back. It seems almost impossible, looking back, how close everything came to remaining broken forever." "I think of it often," Eleanor admitted. "I nearly did not come at all, you know. I told myself 100 times in the weeks before that night that the locket was not worth the risk, that I should simply let it remain hidden in that library wall forever, rather than face the danger of being discovered on Ravenswood grounds again. It was only a particularly cold and lonely evening in Thornfield, missing my mother more fiercely than usual, that finally convinced me to make the journey." "I am glad you did," Charlotte said simply, looping her arm through Eleanor's as they continued their walk. "I do not think I could have borne losing you permanently, Eleanor. You were the sister I never had, and these past 3 months without you have been among the loneliest of my life, even with Julian's grief and Margaret's false comfort surrounding me the whole while." "What of you?" Eleanor asked, glancing sideways at the younger woman with gentle curiosity. "Edward Vane's betrayal must have wounded you deeply as well, Charlotte, whatever schemes he was truly pursuing beneath his pretense of affection. Have you allowed yourself to grieve that loss properly, or have you been too occupied with worry for the rest of us to attend to your own heart?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the distant tree line where the afternoon light had begun to soften into the gold of early evening. "I grieve the idea of him more than the man himself, I think," she said slowly. "I see now how little of what I believed I loved was ever truly real. It is a strange kind of sorrow, mourning an illusion rather than a person, but it is sorrow all the same. I am recovering from it, though perhaps more slowly than I let on to Julian, who already carries enough worry for the both of us." "You need not hide it from me," Eleanor said, squeezing her arm gently. "Whatever time you need, Charlotte, I intend to remain close enough now that you never need carry such burdens alone again." Charlotte's smile, when it came, held a warmth that suggested the words had landed exactly where they were needed. "There is a gentleman," she admitted, a faint color rising in her cheeks. "Nothing serious, not yet. Only a neighbor's son who has called upon us twice since Julian's return, ostensibly to discuss matters of no particular importance regarding the boundary hedge between our properties. I confess I have found myself looking forward to his visits rather more than the state of a hedge would reasonably justify." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, laughing properly for what felt like the first time in months, "Ravenswood is not quite finished with happy endings yet." The two women continued their walk as the afternoon light deepened toward evening, and Eleanor found herself marveling at how completely the shadows of the past months had begun to lift, not merely from her own life, but from the entire household that had suffered alongside her, through the long uncertainty of Margaret and Edward Vane's deception. The wedding took place in early summer, a modest but joyful ceremony held in the small chapel on the Ravenswood estate, attended by the household staff who had known and loved Eleanor since her earliest days as Charlotte's companion, along with a careful selection of neighboring families, whose good opinion Julian had judged worth cultivating for Eleanor's future comfort in county society. Eleanor wore a simple gown of pale blue silk, her mother's locket finally recovered from its hiding place in the library wall, and worn proudly at her throat alongside the sapphire ring that had marked the beginning of their renewed engagement in that lamplit London street. Standing before the small gathered assembly, watching Julian's face as he spoke his vows with a steadiness and certainty that carried none of the fear or hesitation that had once cost them so dearly, Eleanor felt the last lingering shadow of those 3 lonely months in Thornfield finally, completely dissolve. Whatever grief and injustice had marked the path that brought them to this moment, the future stretching out before them now felt solid and certain in a way she had once feared she would never know again. "I take you, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the small chapel, "not merely as my wife, but as the truth I nearly lost through my own foolish doubt, and which I intend to honor, protect, and cherish every single day that remains to us, however many years that may be." Eleanor's own vows, spoken through tears she made no effort to hide, carried the same fierce certainty. "I take you, Julian, understanding now what it means to lose someone through fear rather than through any true failure of the heart between us. I forgive the man who doubted, because I have come to know, more deeply than I ever expected, the man who searched, who never stopped searching, until the truth finally found its way home." As they turned to face the small gathered crowd, now husband and wife, applause and joyful tears rippling through the chapel, Eleanor caught Charlotte's eye across the assembled guests, the younger woman beaming with a happiness that mirrored her own, and felt, for the first time since that terrifying, hopeful midnight return through a broken castle gate, that every fear she had once carried had finally, fully given way to something far stronger. Home, she understood now, had never truly been the stone walls of Ravenswood itself, however dearly she loved them, nor even the title she now carried as Duchess. It had always been this: the people who had searched for her, fought for her, and refused to let a lie stand unchallenged between them and the truth. As Julian led her from the chapel into the warm golden light of the early summer afternoon, the whole of Ravenswood's household and grounds spread out before them in joyful celebration. Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Ravenswood, finally allowed herself to believe, completely and without reservation, that the life she had once feared lost forever had, in truth, only just begun. A year passed at Ravenswood, and the castle that had once held so much sorrow for Eleanor now felt entirely her own, its corridors filled with warmth rather than the cold uncertainty that had once driven her fleeing through its gardens in the dark. She had taken to the responsibilities of Duchess with a steadiness that surprised even herself, overseeing the household accounts alongside Mrs. Fenimore, corresponding with tenant families across the estate, and slowly, patiently, rebuilding the sense of trust and order that Margaret's long deception had quietly eroded over the years without anyone fully realizing the extent of it. It was on a bright morning in early autumn that a letter arrived from Yorkshire, addressed in a careful, familiar hand that made Eleanor's breath catch the moment she recognized it. Margaret had written only twice in the year since her departure, brief, stilted notes to Julian that offered little beyond formal inquiries after Charlotte's well-being. This letter, however, was addressed directly to Eleanor herself, the first time Margaret had done so since the truth of her betrayal had come to light. Eleanor carried the letter to the garden before opening it, seating herself on the same stone bench where she had once spent so many quiet afternoons with Charlotte during her earliest days at Ravenswood. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, uncertain what she might find within, whether further justification or something closer to genuine remorse. The letter, when she finally read it, contained neither excuse nor elaborate apology, only a simple, halting account of the quiet life Margaret had built for herself in Yorkshire, tending a small garden, assisting the local parish with its charitable work among the poor, finding, in the plainness of her reduced circumstances, a kind of peace she confessed she had never known during her years of careful, watchful dependence at Ravenswood. Near the letter's end, she wrote a single line that Eleanor read 3 times before setting the pages down in her lap, her eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. "I understand now that I mistook survival for love, and in doing so, I very nearly destroyed the one thing in this world I claimed to be protecting. I do not ask your forgiveness, Eleanor, for I am not certain I have yet earned the right to it. I ask only that you know I think of the harm I caused you daily, and that I am trying, in whatever small ways remain open to me, to become someone worthy of the family that once, despite everything, called me their own. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long while, the autumn sun warm against her face, before finally rising and carrying it inside to find Julian in his study, the same room where so much of their reconciliation had first taken shape. He read it in silence, his expression unreadable, before setting it carefully upon his desk. "What do you make of it?" he asked quietly. "I believe she means it," Eleanor said after some consideration. "Whether that is enough to warrant any further reconciliation between your families, I cannot say. That decision belongs to you, Julian, more than to me. But I no longer feel the anger toward her I once carried so fiercely. I find, instead, that I simply hope she finds whatever peace she is searching for, wherever that search eventually leads her." Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands. "Perhaps in the spring we might invite her to visit," he said finally. "Not to return permanently, not yet, and perhaps not ever. But a visit, carefully arranged, might tell us more about whether her words carry the weight they claim to hold. I find I am not yet ready to close that door entirely, whatever wrong she has done." "Then we will decide together, when the spring comes," Eleanor said, and something in the quiet, shared weight of that decision felt, to her, like the truest measure of how far they had traveled since that frightened, uncertain night she had first crept back through the broken castle gate. Julian folded the letter carefully, and set it inside the same locked drawer where he had once kept the forged pages that nearly destroyed everything between them, though this time the gesture carried none of the old grief, only a quiet acknowledgement that some histories deserved to be kept close, even when they were difficult to hold. "I have also received word from the county court," he said, changing the subject with visible relief. "The matter of Edward Vane and Gerald Finch has been fully settled. Both men were found guilty of forgery and attempted theft of property, and Finch's additional charge of financing the scheme knowingly has seen him stripped of his money-lending license entirely, along with a considerable fine paid directly to the estate as restitution for the trouble caused." "And Edward?" Eleanor asked, though she found she felt little beyond a distant, clinical curiosity about the fate of the man who had once so thoroughly upended her life. "Transported," Julian said. 7 years, to one of the colonies, for the forgery alone, with the threat against my person during the confrontation in London, weighed heavily against him by the presiding judge. I do not imagine we shall hear from him again, whatever life he manages to rebuild once his sentence is served, if indeed he survives it at all. Eleanor considered this news for a long moment, surprised to find that it settled over her not as triumph, but as a kind of quiet closure, the final piece of a chapter she had already, in her heart, set down some months before. "I find I do not wish him harm," she said slowly, "only distance. I hope, wherever he ends his days, he learns something of the cost his choices carried, though I confess I hold little confidence that a man so committed to his own advancement will ever fully understand it. Perhaps that is not our burden to carry any longer," Julian said gently. "We have done what justice required of us. What Edward Vane does with the remainder of his life belongs entirely to him now, and I find I would rather spend my own remaining days building something worth having than dwelling further on a man who nearly cost us everything through his greed." Charlotte's own happiness, meanwhile, had blossomed considerably over the course of the year. The neighbor's son, whose visits had once been so carefully disguised as discussions of boundary hedges, had become, by the following summer, her acknowledged suitor, and Eleanor found particular joy in helping the younger woman prepare for a courtship conducted this time with none of the secrecy and calculation that had once characterized Edward Vane's false attentions. Charlotte's laughter, once dampened by grief and betrayal, had returned in full measure, filling the halls of Ravenswood with a lightness that Eleanor treasured all the more for having witnessed how easily it might have been lost forever. Mrs. Fenimore, ever the quiet backbone of the household, had taken to remarking with evident satisfaction that Ravenswood had not felt so settled and orderly in all her 20 years of service. The old uncertainty and watchful tension that had once hung over the household during Margaret's years of quiet resentment, now replaced by something steadier and considerably warmer. She had grown especially fond of Eleanor's habit of joining her in the still room some mornings, learning the old recipes for preserves and remedies that had been passed down through generations of Ravenswood housekeepers, a small tradition that Eleanor treasured for the simple, unhurried companionship it offered amid the busier demands of managing a great estate. Percival Hawes, too, had settled comfortably into his new position managing the estate's correspondence, his mother and sisters thriving in the small cottage Julian had arranged for their use near the edge of the property. He proved himself, in the months that followed, scrupulously honest in every dealing entrusted to him, as though determined to prove, through sustained good conduct, that his one moment of weakness in London had not defined the whole of his character. Eleanor often thought, watching him work diligently through the estate's ledgers, that Julian's willingness to extend a second chance where one was truly earned had proven, in every measurable way, entirely justified. As for Eleanor herself, the locket that had first drawn her back to Ravenswood on that fateful midnight now rested permanently at her throat, no longer hidden behind a loose stone in the library wall but worn openly, a visible reminder of the mother she had lost and the courage that had carried her, however fearfully, back toward a truth she had once believed lost forever. She had taken, in the quiet hours of early morning before the household fully woke, to walking the same gardens she had once fled through in terror, watching the light change slowly across the frost or the dew depending on the season, marveling each time at how completely a place could transform from a source of grief into a source of steady, abiding comfort. Julian found her there one such morning, wrapped in a warm shawl against the season's first true chill, watching the sun rise slowly over the eastern hills. He came to stand beside her without a word, slipping his arm around her waist, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the light spread gradually across the frozen grass. "Do you remember," he said finally, "the first night you returned? I stood in that study speaking your name to an empty room, convinced I would never see you again, and certain that whatever I had lost through my own cowardice could never truly be recovered." "I remember," Eleanor said softly. "I remember standing outside that door, certain I should turn and run rather than risk being found. I very nearly did, you know. If the floorboard had not creaked when it did, I might have taken my locket and vanished back into the night, and neither of us would ever have known how close we came to finding our way back to each other. Then I am grateful, more than I can properly express, for one poorly placed floorboard," Julian said, and Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying easily across the quiet garden, mingling with the first birdsong of the waking morning. "As am I," she said, leaning into his warmth as the sun climbed fully above the horizon, casting its golden light across the whole of Ravenswood, over gardens once fled through in fear, and now walked through in quiet, settled joy, over a castle that had nearly lost everything to a lie, and had instead, against every fearful expectation, found its way back whole. "As am I, Julian, more than any words could ever properly say."